Seattle carried a heavier kind of night. Not colder, just heavier. The kind where the air stayed close to the skin and the concrete held the smell of rain long after it fell. Down in the underground parking structure, the lights flickered with a worn-out buzz, stretching thin strips of yellow across the wet cement. Water dripped from the overhead pipes in slow, steady taps, echoing through the wide, empty level like a reminder that no one else was supposed to be down here. And in the center of that quiet echo stood Gary Price, wrists locked behind him, shoulders stiff, breath caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief. His clothes were damp, his hair clung to his forehead, but none of that matched the look in his eyes, a look that kept drifting toward the ambulance, as if staring hard enough might force the truth through the chaos forming around him. Paramedics moved quickly around the stretcher. Victoria Hale lay motionless, her face pale under the flashing red and blue lights. Her chest rose unevenly. Her hand twitched once, then went still. Someone called out her vitals. Someone else adjusted the straps. And Gary watched all of it like a man trying to hold on to a moment slipping out of reach. A few yards away, Billy struggled against a young officer's hold. His voice broke each time he tried to call for his dad. His backpack hung off one shoulder. His sneakers were soaked. He looked too small for a night like this. When Gary finally turned far enough to see him, something in his expression changed. Not panic, not anger, just a quiet, painful break. The kind a parent can't hide. The older officer stepped closer, jaw tight, posture set. He studied Gary with the look of someone who'd already decided what the scene meant. One long glance, one slow exhale. A verdict was formed without a single question asked. From where the officer stood, the story looked simple. A woman unconscious, a man she'd fired standing near her, a dark, nearly empty parking level. No witnesses, no camera pointed at the exact corner where it happened. It didn't matter that Gary had heard raised voices and run. It didn't matter that he had stepped between danger and the woman now being loaded into the ambulance. It didn't matter that he had been the one shouting for help, begging someone to come quickly. None of that showed up in the first image the officer saw, and first images tend to stick. A young officer leaned toward his partner, voice lowered but not low enough. He had motive. 2 quiet words, sharp enough to shift every pair of eyes. Gary heard them, his shoulders locked. He tried to speak again, but his voice wavered at the wrong moment, and the sound came out thin. Not guilty, just scared. And fear rarely convinces anyone. Rain hit the metal grates at the far end of the parking structure, the sound echoing through the concrete pillars. Radios crackled, boots splashed, sirens blurred with the rhythm of falling water. Everything moved quickly except for Gary, who stood frozen in the one place he wished he had never been. Then Billy broke free. The officer's grip slipped for a second, and the boy ran, feet slapping against the wet cement, breath shaking, eyes locked on his father with a mix of fear and determination far too big for his age. He didn't shout a full sentence. Just one word, raw, trembling, enough to dent the air around them. "Dad." Gary closed his eyes for a brief moment. One breath, one attempt to hold himself together. When he opened them again, Billy was still running, still crying, still reaching for him, and something inside Gary pulled tighter than the cuffs on his wrists. A paramedic spoke up. "We're moving." The ambulance engine growled. Its lights cut across the lower parking level in quick bursts of color. The older officer tightened his hold on Gary's arm, as if the man in cuffs might suddenly run. But Gary didn't move. He couldn't look away from the back of that ambulance. Because the truth, the only truth, was inside it. And she wasn't awake to speak. The door shut with a heavy, final sound, the kind that stays. The ambulance rolled forward, sirens rising, disappearing up the ramp and into the Seattle rain. And with it went the only witness who could clear him. Gary stood still, breathing through the weight in his chest. Rainwater pooled around his shoes. The cuffs dug deeper into his skin. Billy's footsteps slowed behind him, softer now, more desperate, like a child trying to catch up to a world that suddenly felt too dangerous. Officers talked around Gary. Someone mentioned protocol. Someone else repeated the sequence for documenting the scene. But none of it reached him. He only heard the shaky breath of his son. That was the part that broke him. Not the cuffs, not the suspicion, not the way people looked at him, like they had already decided who he was. It was the fear in Billy's eyes. The fear of losing the last person he had left. Nothing in Gary's life would look the same after this night. And deep down, standing in that cold underground parking structure with rainwater dripping from his sleeves, he knew it. Morning in Tacoma always came a little gray, but their apartment made it feel even grayer. Not sad, just worn. The walls carried a faint smell of old carpet and the quiet hum of a building that had seen too many winters. Gary unlocked the door with the same slow motion he used every morning after a night shift, careful not to wake the downstairs neighbor who complained about everything except the kindness Gary showed him. The apartment wasn't big, a single hallway, a living room that didn't have much in it, a kitchen with an old fridge that rattled whenever the light flickered, 2 bedrooms, barely enough space to turn around in, but it was home. And it was the only place where Gary could breathe without feeling judged. Billy sat at the small table, legs swinging, cereal bowl half finished. He always woke early on the nights Gary worked. He never said why. He didn't have to. Losing a mother changes the way a child sleeps. Gary set his keys down quietly. Billy looked up and tried to smile. The kind of smile kids make when they want to look brave for someone who's already tired. Gary ran a hand through the boy's hair and walked into the kitchen. He moved slowly, the stiffness from last night's shift still sitting in his shoulders. The hours had been long. They were always long, but it was what he had to do. Tacoma wasn't a place where money stretched, and raising a child alone didn't come with instructions. The job was simple. Night security, rotating between corporate buildings that didn't remember his name. The kind of job people walked past without seeing the person in uniform. The kind of job where doing the right thing could still get you in trouble. It had already happened once. Months earlier, Gary had been assigned to HaleTech, the same company where Victoria Hale's name was printed on every wall. One night, he had stepped away from his post for less than 2 minutes to help a delivery driver who looked ready to collapse. The man had been shaking, pale, breathing too fast. Gary had helped him sit down, given him water, and called for assistance. It should have been the right thing. But by the time he returned to his station, Victoria had passed by, and rules were rules. Leaving the post wasn't allowed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't explain much. She just made the decision. He was gone by morning. Gary didn't hate her for it. He didn't hate anyone. He just carried the disappointment quietly, the way he carried most things. Being a single father taught him there wasn't much time for bitterness. After breakfast, Billy packed his small backpack with the same routine every day. 2 pencils, a notebook, a folded drawing of his mother he kept between the pages, and the worn-out keychain Gary gave him years ago. The boy checked everything twice, sometimes 3 times. Anxiety works like that. the fear that something important might disappear without warning. The walk to school was short, but Billy always held Gary's hand until the last possible step before the crossing guard. Some kids stared, some whispered. But the boy didn't let go, not until he absolutely had to. When Billy finally jogged toward the school entrance, he glanced back. He did it every morning. That 1 second of checking, making sure his father was still there, making sure the world hadn't shifted while he blinked. Gary waited until Billy disappeared through the doors before heading back home. Sleep didn't come easily after night shifts, and it came even harder when the apartment felt too quiet. He washed the dishes, vacuumed the hallway, folded laundry, small tasks that filled the silence. When he finally sat down, the weight of the previous night settled on him in a way he couldn't ignore. Victoria fired him once, but he never held it against her. If anything, he remembered the way she looked that night in the parking structure, scared, cornered, exhausted. He stepped in because stepping in was who he was. His wife used to tell him he had a habit of standing between people and their problems, even when it cost him something. He didn't change after she died. If anything, he doubled down on being that man. Billy needed to see what kindness looked like. Not the easy kind, the quiet, inconvenient kind, the sort that didn't get applause, the kind you chose when no one was watching. Gary lived that way even when it hurt him, even when rules punished him for it, even when people misunderstood him. That morning, he sat on the couch, staring at the wall, the echo of last night still clinging to him. The sound of the cuffs, the looks. His son's voice cracked through the cold air. He rubbed his wrist, feeling the mark where the metal had pressed too hard. There were things he couldn't explain to Billy, things he didn't want to. But he knew one truth clearly. No matter how many times the world pushed him into the wrong story, he would keep choosing the right one. For himself, for the memory of the woman he lost, for the boy who trusted him more than anything, for the quiet belief that kindness still mattered, even when it didn't pay the bills. Gary stood up, washed his face, and prepared for another night shift. Another long stretch of hours. Another place where his name didn't matter. But Billy's hug that afternoon would. It always did. The building in downtown Seattle stayed lit longer than the rest of the block that night, its top-floor windows glowing with the kind of pressure only corporate emergencies create. Inside, meetings dragged on past closing hours, screens flickering, voices low, tension settling into the halls like dust. Victoria Hale didn't leave her office until well past 10. Her shoulders were tight from hours of negotiations, and her eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets that refused to behave. She moved through the hallway with that same sharp pace she carried everywhere, the one people always mistook for confidence instead of fatigue. By the time she reached the elevator, the rest of the building had emptied. The silence felt heavier than usual. When the elevator doors slid open into the underground parking structure, the air changed. It was colder, sharper, carrying that metallic echo every concrete sublevel seemed to hold. The lights flickered overhead, some humming, some dim, creating long shadows across the floor. Her heels clicked against the cement, each step bouncing off the pillars around her. She pressed the unlock button on her key fob, waiting for her car lights to flash somewhere in the distance. They didn't. She frowned, clicked again, and then paused when a faint echo of footsteps, ones not matching her own, carried through the stillness. She turned her head slightly. Nothing moved, but the air tightened. Somewhere between the rows of parked cars, a shape separated from the shadows. Marcus Langley stepped forward, hands in the pockets of a jacket that looked too thin for the weather. His face carried the same frustrated confidence he had the day she fired him, a mix of indignation and disbelief that never settled well on him. His voice didn't rise, but the words came out too smooth, too rehearsed, like he had played this scene in his mind too many times. He told her she ruined his life, that people listened to her too much, that she needed to understand what her decisions did to the people beneath her. Victoria felt her pulse sharpen. She wasn't afraid of confrontation, but something in his eyes didn't match the calm tone he used. She stepped back once. He stepped forward. The words got tighter. His jaw clenched. He cornered her verbally first, question after question, accusation after accusation, each one pressing closer than the last. When he moved closer physically, she backed away faster. Her heel caught the edge of a small concrete rise near a support pillar. She lost her balance. The world dipped sideways. Her shoulder hit the ground first, then her head, and the cold cement stole the air from her lungs. The distant ringing in her ears swallowed Marcus's voice. She blinked, but her vision blurred. She tried to sit up, but the room tilted and collapsed again. Her breath came too shallow, too fast. She hadn't fainted since she was a teenager. The fear hit her in a sudden, disorienting wave. Not of Marcus, not of the confrontation, but of her own body shutting down in a place where no one could hear her. Marcus crouched near her, saying something she couldn't quite catch. His tone was sharp now, more frantic than threatening, like he realized things had gone further than he meant. But she couldn't respond. Her chest tightened, her limbs felt heavy, her eyes fluttered. And then another voice cut through the echo. A man's footsteps. Quick, steady, coming closer. Gary Price had been patrolling the neighboring building on his overnight shift. He had just stepped outside to check the perimeter when he heard something. An argument first, then something that sounded wrong, like a body hitting concrete. It made him move faster without thinking, instincts kicking in the way they always did when someone might be hurt. He reached the ramp leading to the lower parking level and scanned the shadows. His eyes adjusted quickly, catching the figure crouched over another one on the ground. His heartbeat jumped. He didn't know who they were. He didn't need to. Someone was down. Someone needed help. He called out, voice firm but steady, the kind he'd used as a guard for years. Marcus jerked up at the sound, startled, then tracked where the voice came from. Gary's silhouette emerged between two pillars, moving with controlled urgency. Marcus backed away a step, not because Gary threatened him, but because the presence of another person changed everything. Marcus muttered something under his breath. Frustration, panic, maybe fear of being seen, and then bolted toward the far side of the structure. His footsteps slapped against the cement, fading quickly before Gary could yell after him. Gary didn't chase him. Victoria wasn't moving. That mattered more. He dropped to one knee beside her, checking her breathing first. Shallow, fast. Her forehead glistened with cold sweat. Her pupils reacted slowly to the dim light. She was conscious enough to hear him, but not fully aware. He steadied her shoulders, trying to keep her from rolling. He called 911 with his free hand, giving their location, describing her symptoms with the clarity of someone who had seen medical emergencies before. The operator asked if she was responsive. She wasn't. They asked if there was head trauma. He wasn't sure, but the way she winced when he supported her suggested she might have hit something hard. They told him to keep her still. He folded his jacket and slid it gently under her head to keep the concrete from freezing her skin further. She blinked at him once, confusion clouding her face. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. He told her, quietly, calmly, to stay with him, to breathe slowly, to let him handle the rest. She didn't hear the words, but she heard the tone, and that was enough to keep her eyes from closing completely. The distant rise of sirens grew louder, bouncing through the concrete pillars. Gary looked toward the entrance, waiting for them to appear. But the moment the first flicker of red-blue lights washed across the wall, everything shifted in a way he didn't expect. Footsteps behind him, shadows moving, officers are spreading out, scanning the scene. They saw a woman down. They saw a man beside her. They saw no one else. They didn't see Marcus. They didn't see the fear in Victoria's eyes. They didn't see how hard Gary was working to keep her awake. They saw a story that wrote itself in 3 seconds, a story that would break the next part of his life open. The sirens grew louder as officers rushed down the ramp into the underground parking structure, their flashlights cutting sharp white paths across the concrete pillars. Gary stayed beside Victoria, one hand steady on her shoulder, the other gripping his phone as the 911 operator continued speaking in his ear. But the moment the officers entered the sublevel, everything shifted. They didn't slow down to take in the scene. They didn't look for anyone else who might have been involved. They saw a woman on the ground and a man kneeling beside her, and they moved with the urgency of people who believed they had already arrived too late. One officer stepped in front of Gary, ordering him to put his hands where they could see them. The tone wasn't angry. It was procedural, automatic, as if this was the 100th time he'd said the same words. Gary tried to explain that he had called for help, but his voice came out uneven, still rough from the rush of adrenaline. The officer didn't pause, didn't ask questions. He simply reached for Gary's wrist, and in that moment, Gary understood something he didn't want to. The situation had already chosen its direction. Another officer knelt beside Victoria, checking her pulse, calling her name. She didn't respond. Her breathing was shallow, her eyelids barely flickering. Without her voice, nothing Gary said mattered. They lifted her onto a stretcher just as the paramedics arrived through the same ramp Gary had run down minutes earlier. The sudden burst of movement made the entire space feel tighter, more chaotic. Orders were shouted. Medical bags were dropped onto the ground. Someone set up an oxygen mask. Someone else pushed the stretcher forward. Through all of it, Gary stood where they told him to stand. Hands lifted slightly, breath trapped in his chest, cuffs clicking shut around his wrists before he even processed the sound. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. He just kept looking at Victoria, hoping she would open her eyes long enough to tell them what really happened. She didn't. A young officer stepped closer, lowering his voice as he glanced toward the stretcher. He spoke to his partner, not to Gary, but the words traveled anyway. This guy had motive. A simple sentence, quiet, almost casual, but it cut straight through him. Another officer mentioned that Gary had once worked for HaleTech. Another noted that Victoria had fired him. None of them asked why. None of them asked what he was doing here. None of them noticed the direction Marcus had run. It didn't matter. They had a man. They had a story. They had a reason that sounded neat enough to write in a report. When the cuffs tightened around his wrists, Gary felt the cold bite of the metal sink into his skin. Not painful, just final. The kind of final that steals the air from a person faster than fear. He tried to get out a sentence, just one, about hearing an argument, about stepping in, about someone running, but his voice cracked again, unsteady at the worst time, and instead of sounding like a witness, He sounded like a man trying not to panic. The officers exchanged glances. That was enough. At the far end of the sublevel, small footsteps suddenly echoed. Fast, uneven, familiar. Billy appeared at the top of the ramp, breathless from running, his backpack bouncing against his shoulder. The young officer who was supposed to be keeping him back sprinted behind him, calling his name, but the boy didn't stop. Not when he saw the stretcher. Not when he saw the paramedics. Not when he saw the cuffs. His voice cracked the moment he recognized what was happening. He didn't say much. Just one word, high, broken, sharp enough to turn every head in the parking structure. "Dad!" Gary's jaw tightened. His breath caught. The whole room seemed to freeze for half a second. Officers paused. Paramedics hesitated. Even the lights felt like they flickered more slowly. Billy ran across the concrete until an officer blocked him gently, lowering himself to the boy's eye level. But Billy pushed against him, eyes wide, cheeks wet, chest rising too fast as the panic took over. He kept calling for his father, voice trembling each time. Gary's chest clenched in a way that hurt more than the cuffs digging into him. He wasn't thinking about being arrested, or accused, or misunderstood. He was thinking about his son watching it happen. Billy looked around wildly, like he was trying to find anything that made sense. He saw the stretcher. He saw Victoria unconscious. He saw officers holding his father's arms. His breathing hitched, a small, choked sound escaping before he could stop it. One of the officers tried to tell him that everything was fine, but nothing about this night was fine. Another officer muttered something about keeping the kid back. Another said this was just protocol. Words that didn't reach Gary. Words that didn't reach Billy. Words that explained nothing. The paramedics pushed Victoria toward the ambulance, moving quickly. She didn't open her eyes. She didn't lift her hand. She didn't say a word that could save the man who had saved her. As the stretcher rolled past Gary, he tried to catch one last glimpse of her face, hoping for even a flicker of recognition. Nothing. Just the slow rise and fall of shallow breathing beneath the oxygen mask. They loaded her into the ambulance, the back doors swinging open just long enough for Gary to see the flash of white interior lights before they closed again, sealing off the only truth that could free him. When the ambulance pulled away, its sirens rising into the thick Seattle night, Gary felt the weight of everything settle onto him with a heaviness he couldn't describe. Officers guided him toward a patrol car. Billy cried harder, louder, fighting against the hands trying to keep him still. The misunderstanding wasn't just bad, it was complete. And as Gary stepped into the back of the police cruiser, he knew the truth didn't matter tonight. Not here. Not now. The only person who could speak for him was unconscious, and the system had already chosen its suspect. The holding room was colder than the underground parking structure, but in a different way. Not the kind of cold that came from rain or concrete. This one came from fluorescent lights that hummed too loudly and an air conditioner that never shut off. Gary sat at the metal table with his hands cuffed loosely in front of him, staring at the blank wall as if the truth might crawl out of it if he focused hard enough. He didn't cry. He didn't shake. He didn't speak unless someone asked him something directly. He just sat there, shoulders heavy, eyes red but dry, trying to replay the night in his mind while the hours stretched into a version of time that didn't feel real. The officers moved around him with the kind of efficiency that made him feel like a file instead of a person. They asked the same questions in different tones: where he was standing, what he heard, how he knew the woman, and why he was near her. Each answer felt smaller than the question. Each explanation sounded weaker than he meant it to. They wrote everything down. But Gary could tell by the way they avoided eye contact that the words didn't land the way he hoped. At some point, an officer mentioned the 48-hour protocol. He said it like it was nothing, just a box to check. Standard procedure. Gary nodded even though the words sank like stones in his stomach. 2 days. 2 days of being held. Not because he was guilty, but because the system didn't know where else to place him while they sorted out the mess. 2 days, while the only witness who could clear him lay unconscious somewhere in a hospital room he wasn't allowed to see. Outside the station, the story was already forming, not officially, not in the way that ends up on paper, but in whispers, in the way people looked at him through the small window of the door. In the conversations, he could hear when officers forgot the walls weren't as soundproof as they thought. A former guard. A man who had been fired. A man found alone with a CEO who couldn't speak for herself. The kind of story that didn't need to be finished for people to fill in the ending. Somewhere across the city, Billy spent the night at the neighbor's apartment. Mrs. Hampton tried her best. Warm blankets, extra snacks, and cartoons turned low, but none of it held the boy together. He stayed awake long after midnight, sitting on the edge of the couch with the old stuffed bear his mother bought him years earlier. The neighbor told him his dad would come back, that it was all a misunderstanding. But children don't process reassurances the way adults do. Fear doesn't soften just because someone says it should. Billy clutched the bear tighter and asked one question over and over. Is my dad coming back? No one had an answer that sounded true enough. Back in the holding room, time moved strangely. Minutes stretched. Hours folded into one another. Officers swapped shifts. Coffee cups changed hands. The hallway lights dimmed and brightened again. And through it all, Gary sat in the same metal chair, elbows on the table, hands wrapped around each other to keep them from shaking. He wasn't afraid of jail. He wasn't afraid of the officers. He wasn't afraid of what they might think of him. He was afraid of what Billy saw that night. Afraid of what that image would become in the boy's memory. Afraid of the kind of fear that grows roots. At one point, an officer placed a folder on the table. Inside were still images from the parking structure's distant cameras. Grainy, blurry. Nothing showed Marcus clearly. Nothing captured the moment Gary stepped in. Nothing proved his innocence. The officer sighed as he flipped through the pages, the kind of sigh people make when they know the truth is bigger than what they can see, but smaller than what they need. We're doing everything we can, the officer said quietly. But Gary could hear the resignation behind the words. Everything they could do was not enough. Not yet. He rested his forehead against his cuffed hands for a moment, letting his breath shake out of him in a slow, controlled exhale. His thoughts drifted to Billy, his small face, the way he tried to hide fear, the way he always checked twice before walking into school to make sure Gary was still standing where he left him. That memory made something inside Gary go tight, like a rope pulled too fast. At the same time, local news stations picked up a vague report. Nothing confirmed, nothing direct, just enough to plant doubt. Former security guard involved in incident with CEO. Not accused, not charged, but involved. In America, that single word could stain a life long before a verdict. People watched from their living rooms, shaking their heads, forming opinions that couldn't be undone later. No one knew his name yet, but they would. They always did. By the second night, the exhaustion sat deep in Gary's bones. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten more than a few bites. Every question he answered felt like a repeat of the one before it. Every officer sounded the same. Every hour felt identical. He rubbed his wrists where the metal had scraped against the skin, not enough to bleed, just enough to leave a mark that would linger long after today. In the early hours of the morning, when the station was quiet and the hallway lights dimmed to save power, Gary whispered something to himself. Not loud, not dramatic. Just a tired, honest thought slipping out into a room that didn't care enough to answer. Why do good men always get punished first? He didn't expect anyone to hear it. No one responded. The room stayed cold. The lights stayed buzzing. The next few hours blended again. Officers walked past him. Papers shuffled. Phone calls came and went. Somewhere outside the walls, Billy finally fell asleep from sheer exhaustion, curled on the neighbor's couch, still gripping his stuffed bear like a lifeline. And Gary remained in that metal chair, alone with the weight of a truth he couldn't prove, and the fear that the world had already made up its mind. 2 days is not a long time. But in those 48 hours, Gary felt every minute like a quiet verdict. Not officially, not legally, just emotionally. 2 days where kindness cost him everything he had left to lose. The hospital room was quiet when Victoria opened her eyes. The kind of quiet that didn't belong to daytime or nighttime. Just that strange in-between stillness where machines hummed softly and the ceiling lights glowed dim, as if the room was trying not to overwhelm her senses all at once. Her vision blurred before it sharpened again, revealing the pale walls, the IV line taped to her arm, and the faint smell of disinfectant lingering around her bed. For a moment, she didn't remember why she was here. Her head felt heavy, her thoughts slow, each memory rising in fragments that refused to form a full picture. A flash of concrete, the cold floor, a shadow leaning over her, voices that twisted into one another, and then something steadier, a hand beneath her head, a voice telling her to stay awake, a man kneeling beside her. She blinked again, slower this time, letting the details settle. Marcus, his anger, his accusations, the way he stepped toward her, the way she stepped back, the fall, the way the air left her chest. And then, Gary. His voice cut through the panic, the way he shielded her, even though she couldn't speak, the jacket he folded and slid beneath her head without hesitation. The call to 911 was made with one hand, while the other tried to steady her breathing. It all returned at once, clear enough to make her heart drop into her stomach. She exhaled shakily, realizing the weight of what might have happened if he hadn't heard her. And then another realization hit her even harder. What the scene must have looked like to everyone else. She forced herself upright, ignoring the dull ache in her ribs. A nurse rushed in, surprised to see her awake, fussing with monitors and adjusting her pillows. She spoke gently, explaining what happened, asking how Victoria felt, reminding her she needed rest. But Victoria barely heard any of it. Her gaze drifted toward the small TV mounted in the corner of the room. The news was on, the volume low, but not low enough to miss the crawl moving across the bottom of the screen. Former security guard involved in HaleTech CEO incident. No accusation, no confirmation, just a headline vague enough to ruin a man's life. A photo of Gary flashed briefly on the screen, his ID picture from years ago, the one taken before the exhaustion settled permanently around his eyes. The reporter's voice floated softly into the room, describing the ongoing investigation, emphasizing the lack of public details. It didn't matter that they didn't use the word suspect. People didn't need that word to assume it. Victoria's stomach turned. Her fingers tightened around the blanket, knuckles pale beneath the pressure. She remembered the day she fired him, how procedural it had felt, how fast the decision had been, how she never asked why he stepped away from his post that night. He had tried to explain. She had cut him off. Rules were rules, and she lived by them, even when they hurt the people who followed them. Her throat tightened with something she didn't recognize at first. Shame. The kind that didn't shout. The kind that settled deep, cold, and steady, making every breath feel heavier. The nurse glanced at the screen, then back at Victoria. "They brought a man in for questioning," she said softly, choosing her words with care. "I'm not sure what the situation is, but it sounds complicated." Victoria didn't respond. She didn't need to. She knew exactly what had happened. She knew how it looked. She knew the system moved fast when the pieces of a story lined up neatly, even if they were the wrong pieces. And she knew Gary, quiet, unassuming Gary, would never fight loud enough for anyone to hear him over the noise of suspicion. Her pulse picked up, not from fear, from urgency. She pushed herself further upright, ignoring the nurse's protests. She needed to talk to someone who could fix this. Someone who listened to her voice the moment it reached their phone. Someone who could walk into a station and stop the wrong story from growing roots. She reached for the bedside table, grabbing her phone with a hand that still trembled slightly. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the only number that mattered right now. The chief of police for Pierce County. She pressed call. The nurse tried to tell her she should wait, that she wasn't stable enough, that she needed rest. But Victoria didn't hear any of it. The call connected on the second ring. The chief answered with the careful tone people use when they expect bad news. Victoria didn't waste time. Her voice was steadier than she felt, but the edge of urgency cut straight through it. She told him she remembered everything. She told him Gary saved her. She told him the man in the parking structure was someone else entirely, someone dangerous, someone who ran the second another person appeared. She told him there was no misunderstanding about who protected her that night, only about who the officers found first. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She didn't stumble. She just spoke the truth clearly enough that the chief paused on the other end. And in that pause, she felt the weight shift. Just slightly. Just enough. When she ended the call, she exhaled a long breath, letting the guilt that had been tightening across her chest loosen a little. Not because everything was fixed. Not yet. But because she had taken the first step in undoing the damage. The nurse adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, still watching the TV with quiet concern. Victoria didn't look at the screen again. She didn't need to. The truth had finally found its voice, and this time, she was awake enough to speak it. The police station felt different the moment the call came in. Officers didn't say anything out loud, but the shift was there. In the sudden quiet, in the way conversations cut off mid-sentence, in the glance exchanged between two detectives standing near the front desk. Gary didn't notice any of it. He sat in the same metal chair he had occupied for nearly 2 days, hands clasped together, eyes fixed on the table. His body was exhausted, but his mind kept replaying Billy's face, the fear in it, the way his small voice cracked when he ran into that underground parking structure. He didn't know how long he had left before they made a decision he couldn't undo. When the door finally opened, Gary didn't lift his head at first. He expected another round of repetitive questions. Another officer is explaining the standard procedure. Another hour of silence. Instead, the detective who entered the room didn't sit across from him. He stood for a moment, breathing in slowly before speaking in a tone Gary hadn't heard since he got here. Measured, slow, careful. Gary, things have changed. That made him look up. The detective slid a file onto the table but didn't open it. Victoria Hale woke up, he said. The words hit harder than they sounded. Gary's breath caught as something in his chest tightened and loosened at the same time. The detective continued. She remembered everything. In the hallway, someone hurried past. Papers shifted. Phones rang. But inside the room, everything felt suspended. She gave a full statement, the detective said. She confirmed you weren't the one who confronted her. She said you protected her. She insisted on it. A pause. Then, she named the real man, Marcus Langley. The name fell like a stone into deep water. A ripple moved through Gary's expression, subtle but visible. Relief wasn't the word. It was something quieter, something rawer. The detective unclasped the cuffs with a steady click. The release wasn't dramatic. No apology speech. No grand gesture. Just the sound of metal unlocking after holding him in place for too long. Gary rubbed his wrists slowly. The marks still visible. The skin reddened. The detective told him he was free to go. But freedom didn't feel like a door swinging open. It felt like standing up for the first time after being underwater. It took a few seconds for his legs to steady beneath him. When he reached the station lobby, Billy was already there, curled in a chair, head resting against Mrs. Hampton's arm, half asleep from exhaustion. The moment he spotted his dad, he sat up too fast, eyes wide and glassy. He didn't run this time. He walked quickly, chest tight, tears rising again, but differently now. Gary dropped to one knee and pulled him close. Billy held on with both arms, clinging like he was afraid the moment might disappear if he blinked. Gary closed his eyes, letting the boy's heartbeat settle against him. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The relief came quietly, in the way Billy's breathing steadied against his shoulder, in the way the boy's fingers curled into his jacket, in the way the world finally stopped spinning for both of them. But the story didn't end there. Not for the officers, not for Victoria, not for Marcus. Once Victoria finished giving her statement, she stayed awake long enough to answer every question the detectives had avoided earlier. She described Marcus's voice, the way he stepped toward her, the way his anger sharpened into something more dangerous. She told them everything he said before she fell, everything he did, everything he threatened. And when the detectives ran his name through the system again, they found something they had missed on the first pass. A prior incident flagged for aggressive verbal conduct months before he was fired. Not enough to charge him then, but enough to understand that confrontation wasn't new territory for him. A bolo went out statewide. Officers in nearby counties were alerted. Patrol cars checked transit stations, bus stops, train platforms, cheap motels, anywhere someone might try to disappear quietly. 12 hours passed, then 15, then 20. And finally, just after dawn the next morning, a call came in from Spokane. A convenience store clerk had recognized Marcus from the bulletin posted near the register. He had seen the man pacing outside earlier, carrying a partially filled duffel bag, checking over his shoulder too often. Patrol officers arrived within minutes. Marcus didn't run at first. He tried to talk his way out, claiming coincidence, claiming confusion, claiming he was just passing through. But the minute they asked him to step aside, his eyes gave him away, darting toward the alley behind the building, searching for an exit that didn't exist. When he finally made a move to run, the officers were faster. They brought him down with enough force to stop the escape, but not enough to harm him. He was handcuffed on the wet asphalt, breathing hard, muttering a mix of blame and disbelief as if the world had wronged him again. The detectives called Victoria first, then the Pierce County chief, then the Tacoma police. But the final call, the one that mattered most, was made to Gary. He answered on the second ring, his voice still rough from the long night and the longer fear that hadn't fully left him yet. The detective didn't offer a speech, or reassurance, or comfort. Just the truth. We found him. Gary didn't say anything for a moment. He just closed his eyes and let the exhaustion settle into his bones in a different way. A way that didn't carry despair this time, just release. The detective added quietly, "You saved her. She made sure we knew that." Later that day, Gary stepped out of the apartment building with Billy by his side. The air felt lighter, not warm, not soft, just lighter. At the bottom of the stairs, a black sedan waited, one Gary recognized from HaleTech's executive lot. Victoria stepped out, slowly, carefully. She walked toward him with the kind of calm that didn't come from confidence, but from understanding. She didn't bring a speech. She didn't bring an entourage. She just came with the truth. She hadn't been able to give him in that underground parking structure when it mattered most. She met his eyes and said quietly, "You saved my life." Gary didn't answer. Not right away. But something in his stance shifted. A small, barely noticeable ease in his shoulders. Billy stood closer to him, watching her with cautious eyes, remembering the night everything fell apart. Victoria looked at the boy, then back at Gary. "I'm here," she said, "to make sure what happened to you never happens again." And for the first time in 2 days, the world finally felt like it was tilting in the right direction again. The rain had softened by the time Victoria reached the small apartment complex in Tacoma, but the sky still carried that muted gray tone Seattle never seemed to lose. She stepped out of the sedan slowly, as if the ground itself required permission before she walked across it. Her driver stayed inside the car. She didn't want an audience. She didn't deserve one. The walkway leading to Gary's unit was narrow. The concrete cracked in a few places, and the railings chipped from years of weather. It wasn't a place she had ever imagined herself standing. Not because it was beneath her, but because she had never bothered to look past the world she lived in long enough to imagine a different one. She reached the door and hesitated, noticing the faded doormat, the small potted plant someone had tried to keep alive, the scuff marks near the bottom where a child's shoes had kicked it over time. Before she could knock, the door opened. Billy stood there, frozen. His backpack was on the floor behind him, the zipper half open. He didn't speak. He just stared, wide-eyed, cautious, uncertain. He remembered her, not from the office, not from headlines, from the night his world cracked open. Gary stepped into view behind his son, hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder. His posture was steady, but his eyes held the quiet exhaustion of someone who had been carrying more weight than anyone should. When he saw Victoria, he didn't step back. He didn't step forward. He just waited. Victoria swallowed, the words collecting in her chest before they found their shape. She hadn't practiced this. There was no script for the kind of apology that needed to come from a place deeper than pride allowed. "I was wrong," she said, her voice low, not shaking but not steady either. "Twice." Gary didn't respond. Billy moved closer to him, like he needed the reassurance of physical nearness before he could trust the moment. Victoria's eyes drifted past them into the apartment, A small living room, an old couch, a stack of school papers on the table, a pair of shoes by the door. It was a simple life, a hard one, and she had made it harder. "You didn't deserve what happened," she continued, her breath fogging lightly in the cold air between them. "You saved my life, and I let the world think you were the one who hurt me." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was factual, honest, heavy enough to land without being forced. Gary finally spoke, but his voice was quiet, almost flat. "You didn't let them think it," he said. "They were going to think it anyway." She felt the truth of that. It didn't excuse her, but she understood. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant for someone to be punished simply for standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. She looked at Billy again. His small face, partly hidden behind his father's arm, held something she recognized, fear mixed with memory. Not fear of her, fear of the system she represented, the system she had contributed to. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," she said softly. "I don't expect it. I just needed you to hear the truth from me, not from anyone else." Gary's jaw tightened slightly. Not anger, just a man holding himself steady in a moment he didn't ask for. Rain tapped lightly against the metal railing nearby. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The world kept moving while the three of them stood in a silence that felt heavier than any accusation. Victoria took a breath that felt like stepping into cold water. "What happened to you should never happen to anyone," she said. "I can't erase it, but I can make sure it doesn't happen again." Billy shifted his weight. Gary rested his hand gently on the boy's back. It was a protective gesture, but also a grounding one, for both of them. Victoria looked at Gary directly, her voice steadied. "You protected me. You protected someone who didn't protect you back. I'm trying to fix that now." Gary held her gaze for a long moment. There were 1,000 things he could have said, 1,000 ways he could have made her feel the weight of those 2 days he spent in a cold room with nothing but suspicion and silence. But Gary was not a man who used pain as a weapon. When he finally spoke, his words were simple. "Just don't let this happen to someone else." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't acceptance. It was a boundary, a request, a truth. The kind that didn't need volume to carry power. Victoria nodded once, slow and deliberate. She stepped back from the door, giving them space, respecting the distance that would take time to close, if it ever did. "Thank you for opening the door," she said quietly, more to Billy than to Gary. She turned toward the stairs, the air cool against her face, the weight in her chest settling into something she knew wouldn't disappear anytime soon. But for the first time since the night everything fell apart, she felt the faint shift of something real. Responsibility, not guilt. Action, not remorse. Behind her, Gary closed the door gently, not shutting her out, just protecting the world inside. Victoria returned to HaleTech, carrying a kind of quiet resolve that the building had never seen from her before. The headquarters, glass, steel, polished stone, had always reflected her authority. But today it reflected something else. The weight of a woman finally seeing her own blind spots. Employees moved aside as she walked through the lobby, not out of fear, but because something in her posture made them step back instinctively. She didn't look like a CEO arriving for a normal day. She looked like someone who had come to correct the consequences of her own decisions. Her heels echoed through the hallway as she entered the executive floor. Assistants straightened in their chairs. Department heads glanced up. She didn't acknowledge any of them. She went straight to the conference room where her leadership team was already gathered, whispering about the arrest in Spokane, the media flare, the incident, and how it might affect quarterly forecasts. The moment she stepped inside, the room fell silent. She didn't sit at the head of the table. She stood. Her voice was calm when she began, but the calm wasn't soft. It carried a firmness that left no space for debate. We failed. No one moved. No one breathed. She continued. A man who worked for this company showed more integrity in one night than any of us have shown in a year, and our system, the system we built, punished him for it. Eyes shifted around the table. Some uncomfortable, some defense, some are quietly ashamed. She spoke about what happened in the underground parking structure, about Marcus Langley's behavior, about the confrontation, about her fall, about waking up in the hospital and seeing Gary's face on the news. She didn't sugarcoat anything. She didn't soften her own role. She said the words plainly, letting them sit where they landed. I fired the wrong man, and because of that decision, the night he saved my life was the same night he lost his own. The executives exchanged glances. No one dared interrupt. Victoria outlined a plan that wasn't a suggestion. It was a mandate. Every camera in every sublevel needed upgraded angles and blind spot corrections. Every guard and janitorial staff member needed access to a safety override line, one that allowed them to step away from their post to help someone in danger without risking disciplinary action. A new department would be built, employee care and human safety. Not an HR extension, not a formalities division, a real system built to protect the people who protected the company. One executive tried to object, mumbling concerns about the budget. Victoria didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She looked at him with a steadiness that froze every argument in his throat. A man nearly lost his son because we chose efficiency over humanity. You're talking to me about a budget? The room stayed silent after that. By noon, the internal announcement had been drafted. By 2, the board had been informed. By 5, construction estimates were already being evaluated. But the part she needed to do herself wasn't corporate. It wasn't financial. It was personal. She waited until early evening when the sky dimmed and most employees had gone home before she made her way to the security office on the lower floor. The head of building operations stood when she entered, confused, surprised, maybe both. She asked for a personnel file, one that had been inactive since the night she fired him. Gary Price. She took the folder in both hands and walked out without explaining anything. The next morning, she drove to Tacoma alone. The air was crisp, the sky low with winter clouds drifting slowly across the horizon. She didn't rehearse her words this time. Not because she didn't care how they sounded, but because she knew honesty didn't need polishing. When she knocked, there wasn't hesitation like last time, just a quiet breath before the door opened. Gary looked different in daylight, not lighter, not happier, just more real, every line of exhaustion visible, every long night carried on his face. Billy hovered behind him, backpack on, ready for school. Victoria greeted him softly before turning her focus to Gary. She held the folder against her chest, like it weighed more than paper. I came because I need to offer you something, she said, choosing each word with care. Not as a favor, not because I feel guilty, because you're the only person who can help me fix what I broke. Gary didn't respond immediately. He waited, listening. She explained everything, the new department, the safety override system, the policy reforms, the blind spot corrections, the funding redirection. She spoke without force, letting the truth stand on its own. Then she handed him the offer letter. Director of Human Safety and Dignity Program. The title felt heavy, too formal, too big, too sharp. Gary held the envelope as if it belonged to someone else. He read the title once, then again. His eyes shifted, not with excitement, not with gratitude, but with hesitation, with memory. The memory of cold metal cuffs. The memory of officers saying he had a motive. The memory of his son watching helplessly. The memory of being punished for doing what was right. "I can't go back to that building," he said finally. His voice wasn't angry, just tired. "I can't walk into those halls and pretend everything is normal." Victoria nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in understanding. "I'm not asking you to pretend," she said. "I'm asking you to build something better than what we made you go through." She looked at Billy then, standing small behind his father, holding the strap of his backpack as it anchored him. "This job isn't about me," she added softly. "It's about people like you. People like him. People who shouldn't have to fear consequences for doing the right thing." Billy stared up at his dad. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. "You help people," he whispered. "You always do." It wasn't persuasion. It wasn't pressure. It was a truth only a child could say without bending it. And that truth settled into Gary like a weight he didn't know he needed to feel. He exhaled slowly. The kind of breath a man takes when he stands on the edge of a decision that will reshape his life. He looked at the envelope one more time. The title didn't feel like an award, or compensation, or apology. It felt like a responsibility, one he hadn't asked for, one he might actually deserve. When he looked back up, the answer wasn't in his words. It was in the shift of his shoulders, the steadiness returning slowly. "Okay," he said. "Just one word. Plain. Quiet. True." Victoria didn't smile. She didn't show relief. She simply nodded with the respect of someone who understood the value of what he had just chosen. There was no handshake, no dramatic music, no symbolic gesture. Just three people standing in the doorway of a small apartment in Tacoma, knowing something important had just changed. Not loudly, not publicly, but deeply. And for the first time since the night the world broke, the path ahead finally felt like something Gary could walk without fear. 6 months later, the HaleTech auditorium looked nothing like the place where numbers and metrics once took priority over everything else. The stage had been rebuilt for the company's first ever Human Safety Summit, a day meant to mark the beginning of a system that finally valued the people who kept the building alive. Rows of employees filled the seats. Guards, janitors, technicians, office staff, people who had spent years unseen in the background. Today, the room was theirs. At the front row sat Billy, his feet not quite touching the floor, shoes tapping lightly as he waited for his dad to walk on stage. He wasn't nervous, he wasn't scared, he was proud in that quiet, earnest way children show pride. Back straight, hands folded, eyes fixed on the curtains. When Gary finally stepped into the light, the room shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly. It was a softer shift, a collective breath held for a man most of them had never met, but had heard enough about to understand the weight he carried. He wore a simple suit, nothing expensive, nothing polished, just something that fit who he was. A man who had learned the hard way that dignity mattered more than appearance. He approached the podium, adjusted the microphone once, and let the silence settle before he spoke. His voice wasn't commanding. It wasn't trained for speeches. It was steady, worn at the edges, honest in a way that didn't need performance. He talked about the night everything fell apart. Not in detail, not with drama, but with clarity. He talked about fear, about misunderstanding, about the cost of systems that punish people before asking what happened. He talked about how kindness shouldn't require courage, but often does. The audience listened without shifting in their seats. They heard something deeper than a recounting of events. They heard a man telling the truth, without bitterness, without anger, without needing to hurt anyone who once hurt him. As he continued, his gaze landed briefly on Billy, and something softened in his voice. He spoke about second chances, not the dramatic kind, but the practical kind that allows people to keep their dignity intact. The kind that lets a parent come home at night without fear. The kind that reminds people that being good shouldn't cost everything. Behind him, on a large screen, a slide changed to reveal the plans he'd helped design over the past months. The employee safety override, the blind spot camera corrections, the training protocols, the emergency support line, and the new community standards that placed humanity above strict procedure. It wasn't a list of reforms. It was a blueprint for a safer, more decent place. When Gary finished, he didn't raise his voice for emphasis. He didn't wait for applause. He simply stepped back from the podium, hands resting loosely at his sides, as if letting the truth breathe on its own. The applause came anyway, slow at first, then fuller, then rising into something warm that filled every corner of the room. In the front row, Billy lifted his chin, eyes shining with a pride he didn't try to hide. Victoria stepped onto the stage after the applause quieted. She didn't stand at the podium. She stood beside Gary, slightly behind him, in a gesture that spoke more loudly than any speech could. When she addressed the room, her voice carried none of the rigid authority she once led with. It carried weight, but a different kind. The weight of responsibility. The weight of a mistake is owned fully. She spoke about Gary, not as a savior, not as a symbol, but as a man the company failed. She apologized publicly, clearly, without qualifiers. It wasn't performative. It wasn't rehearsed. It was direct. "We talk about justice as if it's a verdict," she said. "But justice is also a choice we make every day. To see people clearly, to listen before judging, to protect those who protect us." She paused, letting the words settle. Gary reminded us that rules matter, but people matter more. A quiet stillness spread across the room. Not heavy, just real. When she stepped aside, she didn't take the spotlight with her. She left it where it belonged. After the event ended, employees gathered around Gary, not in swarms, not with fanfare, but with small gestures of gratitude. A guard shook his hand. A janitor thanked him softly. A young intern said she felt safer coming to work now. These weren't dramatic moments. They were the kinds of moments that rebuild something piece by piece. Later that evening, Gary and Billy walked outside together. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Billy held his dad's hand loosely, swinging it a little, talking about school, about a project, about a joke he heard from a friend. The world felt normal again. Not perfect, not fixed, just normal. And for Gary, normal was enough. They reached the edge of the lot where the light softened into gold. Gary paused, looking at the building, not with resentment, but with a quiet acceptance. The place that once broke him had become the place he helped repair. Billy tugged his hand gently, grounding him back to the present. "Dad?" he asked. "Are you okay?" Gary looked down at him, then back at the sky. He let out a breath, slow and steady. "Yeah," he said. "I think I finally am." They stood there for a moment, just a father and a son, framed by fading sunlight, carrying a future that no longer felt heavy. Some endings arrive loudly, some arrive quietly. This one arrived the way healing often does, soft, earned, and steady enough to last.